Hi class, this is Susan Priest, and we're talking for this week in this module about the ideas of Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. So the goals are really modest. So really it is to identify and explain the categorical imperative and really spend some time reflecting on the moral theory of Kant and applying it to a specific contemporary moral problem. And in this, you can kind of create arguments for and against Kant's moral theory. So as much as possible, try and, as a philosophical experiment, try to not relate personally to everything. That may sound strange, but try to actually just embrace the idea and see what its limits are. So that's the concept for the next few weeks. We're going to be trying out different moral theories, and I want you to really inhabit the moral theory and test its limits. So I am doing a very brief review of the categories of philosophy, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want you to know something particular about Immanuel Kant and why he's so important in the history of Western philosophy. He's incredibly important, and he's very difficult to read, and I confess that I like reading him, so maybe I will be portraying some sort of bias in that. But I think, despite the fact that his writing is difficult to comprehend, if we can unpack it a little bit, I want you to see how straightforward it is. So, as a review, there are 4 major categories in philosophy. So, we're really this semester looking at, in this class, mostly looking at values and questions related to ethics. We're not spending as much time on logic, questions related to correct reasoning, or metaphysics or epistemology. However, because metaphysics and epistemology are generally the starting place in the exploration of philosophy, it's often helpful to know where these different moral philosophers are coming from, because it actually informs your understanding of their ethical theories. So as a mini review, I want to say that in the discipline of metaphysics, there are basically 2 different ideas, categories, and some people might describe this differently, but just for the sake of this particular lecture, I'm kind of reducing it down a little bit. But you can kind of look at different metaphysical theories and divide them between those who say the nature of reality is 2 or dualistic. So the whole idea that we have a mind and a body, and that the mind is separate from the body, is a dualistic idea. And much of Western philosophy is very influenced by the ideas of Plato and Descartes, who really support the idea of a dualistic thinking. There are also theories out there which support a monistic or unified idea about reality. So last week we were talking about Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes actually had a monistic idea, which is that all of reality is materiality. So there's no such thing as spirit or mind or something that is separated from physical reality. So we also have people that we're not reading this semester at all that you may or may not be familiar with, like George Berkeley, who is an English philosopher who believed that everything is from the mind. So he had a monistic view of the world, but it wasn't about everything is material, but everything is thought. So That's one category of questions. The second category of questions, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about with relation to Immanuel Kant, is the field of epistemology. So now this becomes confusing because of the word rationalism and how you're going to appropriate that idea. Generally speaking, people go, oh, this is rational, it's thoughtful and well-reasoned. But when we're looking at categorizing different approaches in epistemology, we're looking at the difference between people who believe in a priori knowledge, which is that knowledge comes before experience. Okay? A priori means before experience. So the rationalist philosophers, like Plato and Descartes, I might add, see that and assert that people know things prior to experiencing them. On the other side, we see a different viewpoint coming through empiricism, which is the idea that we experience knowledge a posteriori, which is we gain knowledge through experience. So experience happens and then we know. So certainly through people like Aristotle and David Hume, whom we're not covering this semester. I suppose we could have, but I chose not to. A very interesting Scottish philosopher who believed that we know things through our experience. We go out, and this is really the scientific method. We go out, we seek information. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that Immanuel Kant holds a very interesting place in the history of Western philosophy. So he's a German or Prussian philosopher, most commonly associated as being like a key person in the Age of Enlightenment. So just to contextualize, he was writing in Germany. His major work was published the same year the American Revolution ended, in 1783. So one of the ideas that he gets known for is that he's one of the only philosophers to say, hey, I think we use both rationality and experience to understand things. So he created a bridge theory. He created what's often called in philosophy an epistemological bridge, where he was trying to create a bridge between rational and empirical ideas. So he says we do perceive through concepts, like we have some concepts a priori, but we also, as he agreed with David Hume, we experience the world through events. Now, interesting thing that so he kind of was one of the few philosophers to say, hey, it's both sides of the coin, which I find very intriguing, because there's actually nobody else in the history of philosophy who really does this in the same way. So you might ask, well, what does that have to do with moral theory? One thing it does is it shows us something about his placement in the history of philosophy. Is he's a very unique thinker. So I think this is interesting. He said that we cannot perceive uncaused change. So we can't, if we have glasses on, like I'm legally blind without my glasses, I put my glasses on and I see the world through my lenses. But I can't actually see the world, well, not only literally I can't see the world without my glasses, but we can't see the conditions of things before they arrived in front of us. I don't know how else to say it. The other interesting idea he said is that we try as best as possible to understand things. You know, like right in front of me now is my computer screen and my bookshelf and my coffee mug and some other things that are kind of like pictures of family around my office that I have. But I can't, Immanuel Kant would argue that I can't know the things in front of me in and of themselves. They are somehow elusive to me. He called, German is very interesting because it creates these phrases that we actually don't have in other languages. So das Ding in sich is a Kantian concept that really the thing in and of itself we can't know. So I'll give you an example. So I have a picture of you can't see it, but I have a little picture of my husband, who's a guitar player, and it's this picture of him. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the picture. I'm just going to talk about the idea that I can't ever really know this other person, even though I'm married to him, even though I spend a lot of time. So think about the person who's really important to you, your friend, your lover, your child, and how, no matter how much time you spend with them, you can't really know everything about them. Now, include this in now with what we can say about Immanuel Kant's theory about morality. So, now we know that he likes to fuse both rationality and empirical or scientific inquiry. And I'm relying on a couple of philosophy authors, Brooke Moore and Kenneth Bruder, to help me out here, because I think they do a really good job of summarizing Immanuel Kant's argument. First, they say, okay, here is his first assertion. Scientific inquiry is based on experience. Therefore, scientific inquiry can never reveal to us principles that we know hold without exception. Right? Because we can't observe. Remember how we can't observe uninitiated change? So there's no way that we can actually observe a principle that holds true without exception. We just can't do it. His second claim is that the essence of moral principles, according to Immanuel Kant, is that they do hold without exception. So he would argue it is, if we made the claim it's wrong to torture helpless children, then it would be wrong for anyone at any time to torture helpless children. And so, therefore, his argument is that moral principles cannot be revealed through scientific investigation, but only through reason. So, therefore, we can't use scientific principles to support or deny ethical reasoning. We can only use our mind and these thought experiments. So that's why Kant is kind of a perfect case study for us to sort of play with. Okay, so two terms that you have to know are associated with the ethical theories of Kant. Now, the first is a word that you won't hear very often, and it's kind of convoluted, but it's deontology. So it's not just deontological, it actually refers to duty ethics. So that word deontology is duty ethics. And then the word that I want you to associate most with Immanuel Kant's moral theory is the categorical imperative. So what is the categorical imperative? To act always in such a way that your actions would be right if they became a universal law. So he's saying that you can determine, and actually Immanuel Kant was trying to say, hey, we can understand what is moral without having refer or appeal to a belief in God. Now, even though Immanuel Kant was a very religious man, he said you don't have to appeal to religious beliefs in order to justify what is moral and ethical. So, and according to Kant, you should do your moral duty simply because it is your moral duty. So that idea that ethics belongs in the realm of, you should do this because it's the right thing to do. So that kind of concept, really associate that with Immanuel Kant. Now, in the reading assignment that you have for this week, you'll notice that he does talk about hypothetical imperatives. And just to clarify, a hypothetical imperative is the idea that one should do something because of the desired end. So the consequence of the act. And Kant disagrees with this idea because he said you should always treat human beings in every instance as an ends in and of themselves and never just as means. So you shouldn't be nice to your friend because they can give you something. You shouldn't be nice to someone because that will reap some reward, but in fact because it is the right thing to do. So this may seem a little simplistic, but this is my go-to explanation for the categorical imperative. So we could look at there's probably many reasons why you could say it's not right to pick flowers from your neighbor's yard, right? You could say, oh, that's wrong. If your kid asked you, can I just take flowers from the neighbor's yard? Now, someone who is looking at the consequence of the act might say, well, that would make your neighbor feel bad, but what Kant wants to say is you should be able to determine whether this act is right or wrong by saying, okay, if I am allowed to pick flowers from my neighbor's yard without asking, that means everybody on the street should have that same right. So he wants you to take the idea and pretend that it's a universal rule. Okay, so what would your answer be then? I hope you're beginning to see that the answer is if you created flower picking from your neighbor's yard without asking as a universal rule, there would never be any flowers to look at. It would take all the flowers away. So we reject that as that's an immoral act, because when you universalize it, you can see that it's wrong in and of itself. It's a bad idea. You shouldn't do that. So a couple of other ideas. So I have some different textbooks at my reach that I like to refer to. I have used James Rachel's textbooks before in the past when teaching ethics. He's very well regarded, and you can see that James Rachel's is actually somebody that the textbook we're using this semester appeals to. But you don't have this article, so I just want to summarize this article, which really looks at the implications of Kant's moral philosophy. So one idea that James Rachel's points out is that Kant says all human beings have an intrinsic worth because they are capable of using reason to make decisions. So Every one of you has intrinsic worth because you can use reason. You're a human being who can use reason and make decisions. And we should respect all persons' rationality. We should, in fact, assume that everyone is rational, and we should never attempt to use another person for gain. So, another idea, which we haven't really talked about a lot, but anyone's moral theory could then be applied to ideas about how we create systems of justice in society, how do we determine punishment for crime, etc., etc. And Immanuel Kant held to the idea of retributivism for punishing people for criminal acts, which is basically saying punishment for crimes should be determined by the following two principles. People should be punished simply because they have committed crimes. No other reason can be used. So a utilitarian idea is that you punish people for the good of society as a real justification. You put people away to make people feel safe. Kant doesn't like that idea. They're guilty, they should be punished. And how you determine their punishment is the injury done to the person punished, so the criminal, should be comparable to the injury he has inflicted on others. So, quite famously, Immanuel Kant did agree to the ideas of capital punishment because of that. So, what I'd like you to do, so this week it's a quiz and a short essay. So, spend your time really brainstorming what you think and how you would take Kant's moral theory and kind of stretch its limits. So, the final slide here really is, the idea is that you take his core premise. His core premise is that human beings are rational. They are ends in and of themselves. So any kind of idea related to some moral issue should first take into fact and really explore the idea of what it means that human beings are rational. Now notice, you could disagree with that premise, right? That could be a point of departure for you when you're assessing Kant's theory. But really try and just play with it first to see, okay, let's say I agree with Kant. What does this mean? So how would you apply that idea, for example, to current views or laws or ethical standards for differences in sexual orientation or gender orientation? No, sexual orientation is different than gender, so we'll see those as two different ideas. How would you apply the ideas of human beings being rational to rules and laws about care for the environment? Okay, that's kind of a tricky one. So think about that one. And how would you, maybe a little bit more straightforward, if human beings are rational, how would you apply that idea to the problems of discrimination? All kinds of discrimination on the planet. Take your pick. So really look at the idea of the premise, which is really about human beings are rational and they should be treated as ends in of themselves, and that you can actually use reason alone to determine how you create decide whether something is moral or immoral. And you do that following the rules of the categorical imperative. And you turn that moral act into a universal law. So really spend some time playing around with the ideas before you submit your essay. It's a very straightforward week, just a short bit of reading, a quiz, and your essay on applying Immanuel Kant's theory.